Good morning. Today we are going to talk about Form 41C. It is the compensation form that we use if we are accepting something other than paid as offered. So with the class today, I hope to cover and get everybody on the same page for fully understanding why we would use the form. When do we have to use the form? When can we leave it out? How do we apply it to our purchase and sale agreement? And then how do we check the numbers with our closing statement to make sure everything we were trying to do is actually what was done? So first things first is, why do we have this form? Well, we have it because of transparency. It's the whole idea that we're going to be fully transparent in our purchase and sale agreements with where the money is being paid when we talk about our compensation. So here's just a picture of the form, and I'm going to go through and talk about every single part of this individually, but this is Form 41C. It is a one-page form with several options that have pretty big impacts depending on the options you choose. So when are you, the agent, required to sign the 41C? We see that there's a signature line at the bottom and there's initial blocks everywhere, but when are you actually required to do the signing on it? Well, believe it or not, we don't need signatures when every single box is checked, only these bottom three options. So if you are crediting to buyer, if you are reducing your compensation and giving it back to seller, you'll want to sign it. And anytime there's something other than what's listed on here, a signature from the broker is going to be required. So you'll have to sign this broker line on line 30, as well as put in our firm, and then make sure the buyer and seller, again, are initialing it as you would any other option choice on here. Okay, so how on earth do we fill this out? Number one, our first box. When we have buyer broker compensation, no compensation offered, we're going to check this option if there is one of two things that happened. One, if there is a listing in the Northwest MLS and the compensation amount is 0. And number two, if the seller has not signed a listing agreement. So this would be the case if you are doing a for sale by owner, or even if you have a seller representation where there's nothing going on the MLS, but no compensation is being offered to any buyer or broker. The amount that you want to put in, I just labeled as number A. That will be the total amount of compensation you are going to be asking the seller to pay the buyer agent. If you have a buyer with a buyer agreement and your buyer has a separate agreement to pay you, this box is not necessary. Number two, we have additional buyer broker firm compensation. This box is for when some compensation is offered, but maybe it's not enough. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add the additional amount needed in section A. So it says seller agrees to pay buyer broker firm additional compensation of A%. That's going to be the additional amount needed for a total compensation paid of the second line, which is B. Now, B is going to be the total amount of buyer broker compensation paid by the seller. This can only be negotiated if you have a buyer broker agreement that allows you to negotiate this. So keep all of this in mind when you are filling out your buyer agreement, that it directly responds and correlates to how much you can ask for to be paid if there is a deficit or an overage in what you've agreed. The third option is a credit to buyer. Now, this one is for you to give back a portion maybe of the compensation if you and your buyer have agreed on a certain amount and the listing offers more. This is probably one of the more confusing choices out of the rest of the ones that are on this page. So I have a couple slides on this one paragraph. First of all, The buyer broker firm's compensation shall be reduced from the amount offered in the listing by A% of the sales price. That amount that you put in A is going to be the amount of compensation you're going to credit the buyer from the total amount that's offered in the listing. I'm going to skip down to the next part. It says any amount not approved by, buyer broker firm's total compensation paid by a seller shall be B%. So when it says the total on this, the total is going to be the remaining compensation that the seller will be paying to the buyer broker. So if you want to look at this paragraph as a whole, both of these numbers, A plus B, are going to equal the amount offered in the listing. Kind of said more directly, and this was my legal hotline response when I asked for clarity in this box. Their answer said, in the first blank in the provision, the broker should write the percentage of the purchase price or the dollar amount that will be credited to the buyer at closing. The second blank should be completed to reflect the compensation that will be paid to buyer broker after the first portion is used for the buyer's benefit. The values placed in the two blanks should total the compensation offered by the seller as disclosed on Form 21 in paragraph 17. So again, both of these numbers, A and B, will equal the total amount of compensation offered. And if a portion of it is going back to buyer, that is the portion that you write in line 18, number A. The fourth option, now it's called reduction in buyer broker firm compensation, but what it basically means is if you have a compensation amount and you're going to be crediting something back to the seller, this is the box you would choose, because any excess that is over what's being offered will automatically go back to the seller unless you say otherwise where it's going to go. So in this one, the buyer broker firm's compensation shall be reduced from the amount offered in the listing by A. That amount will be the amount it is reduced by. And then the buyer broker firm's total compensation to be paid will be the amount that the buyer broker receives after the reduction. So this box, again, remember, this is the credit back to the seller box. And then there's this happy little other box. So I tried to think of some options that you could use the other box for. And one of the things that wasn't really obvious in this form was how we credit in the event that I have a listing and I find a buyer and I want to refer my buyer to somebody to write up the contract for me for a fee. So anytime we share compensation like that in the same transaction, or maybe the buyer or the listing broker is going to benefit somehow from accepting this specific offer, we do need to make that clear to the buyer and seller that there is that agreement. So you could put that in the other box. I'm sure there are other situations that would apply to the other box. But when we're talking about this form, we're really talking about the transparency of how we are being paid. So that was the best thing I could come up with in this. Now, this does have a tail provision, and they have actually added the tail provision in pretty much every form that has to do with our compensation. So this is the same tail provision that's in our buyer agreement, that's in our listing agreement. It's just added here as well. So to summarize, the way that the 41C works, anytime you put the total amount of compensation in the 41C, you're going to be instructing escrow how much to put in the seller column to be paid at the firm. Any buyer credits will be reduced before the compensation is paid to the firm. And at the end of the transaction, the compensation to the firm will be the actual check cut to disperse your pay. So how much can you negotiate? Well, you need to refer to your buyer broker agreement because you've already predetermined what you are and are not allowed to negotiate. So referring back to our buyer agreement, we will be looking at the percentage or dollar amount that you have chosen to work with your buyer. This is something that you would have put in as the amount you would be paid. So if we can just remember and refer to this, what you put in this amount is the most you can be paid. You cannot be paid more than you've written in this line. So please keep that in mind. If you want any room to negotiate, this is going to be the top dollar that you are allowed to accept. If you put pay as offered in this line, there is no reason for you to add a 41C because you are being offered what is in the listing. There's nothing to negotiate. Second part of the buyer agreement that you're going to have to refer to when you fill out the 41C is what happens in the event of an equal compensation offer, something that's greater or something that's less. Now, in an equal compensation offered, there's nothing to do because what we're going to be accepting is what they've already offered to pay. If we look at an offer that is greater, you have all the choices below. And I'm pulling this up because keep in mind, if you have offered pay as offered in what you're willing to accept in paragraph 5, you're going to not have any choices in this right here. And the option is going to have to be other, not applicable. Same with the seller compensation. If it's less than what has been decided between you, you've offered to accept what was given. So you will not have room to negotiate if that's what you choose to put on your line, paragraph 5. So I wanted to kind of play a game and see if we can just kind of catch the times and the situations where we should or should not use a 41C and how we would respond in our purchase and sale agreement. So getting past this page, how do I get past that? There. All right, so for each checkbox option, think of how you show this outcome on your purchase and sale agreement. So if the checkbox option is what's on the listing, it's going to be, the listing's going to be offered. The option on here is paid as offer. Do you use a 41C? When compensation is offered, as you've already agreed, there is no reason to use 41C. So you do not need it. If the option that you need to exercise is going to be excess pay to the firm, do you need a 41C? The answer is no, we do not need a 41C if we have asked for less, or we have asked for a compensation amount, but there is additional, and we are already saying it's going to come back to our firm. There's no reason for that. Now, if we want to credit to buyer, think of our choices on the 41C. Do we need it? The answer is yes, we do need it when we talk about crediting something back to buyer, and the option we're going to choose is the credit to buyer option. If we have to exercise something that we credit to the seller, do we need the 41C? Yes, we do, because any change in the compensation, we do need to disclose. So this would be the choice that says reduction in buyer broker firm compensation, which would give the excess back to the seller. Now, if the seller is offering less and our buyer has chosen to pay the balance of the compensation to the firm at closing, do we need a 41C? We do not need a 41C. That buyer has already agreed to pay the deficit. So there's no reason to negotiate anything on the purchase and sale agreement. And then if we are being offered less and we want to request to that seller to pay the balance of the compensation to the firm, do we need 41C? And this is probably the one that is the most common that we've seen. The answer is yes. We're going to be asking for additional compensation. So the additional compensation needed box is the one we are going to check. Okay, so now, how do we apply this 41C to our purchase and sale agreements? I pulled up line 17 because this is going to show up on all of our purchase and sale agreements. And the first half of this, I would like everybody to think of as a disclosure. So when it says buyer broker firm compensation, percent or dollar amount offered in listing, that is a disclosure of what the listing is offering. This is a line that we do not change. So number one, do not change the amount of compensation offered on Form 21. It is not a place to write it in. It is only a place to refer to what the listing is offered. The second half of this is what you're going to do about what is offered. If you're accepting compensation as it is, the box will be marked pay as offered. If the compensation is lower than offered, but the excess is paid to our firm, buyer broker firm, you're going to mark the box pay as offered. And if you're accepting the compensation, even if it's lower, but your buyer has agreed to make up the difference, we are again going to mark pay as offered. When do we not mark pay as offered? Well, again, we're not going to change anything that says the disclosure of how much is offered in the listing. If it's 0, it's going to stay 0 here. We do not change anything at all, but on the second half, if we're going to be asking for additional compensation, we are going to mark other, see addendum. If we're asking for the complete compensation to be paid, we're going to say see addendum. If there is a refund of compensation going back to the seller to entice your offer, maybe, we will be marking other, see addendum. And if you have marked the other, see addendum, attach the 41C and list it in the index. So how do we check the numbers to make sure we're right now? We've put the 41C in, we have our purchase and sale. Now what happens when escrow sends us that closing statement and we want to make sure that things are taken out of the correct column? I found an example of what a credit to buyer looks like. So when you're getting your commission disbursement, it will have separately the compensation being given to the firm as well as a credit to the buyer. And if it is pay as offered, it will be listed in the listing and selling side. There will be no other changes made to it.